One of the realest discussions I have ever had in law school was with one of my absolute favorite professors. I had gone out a few nights earlier with some classmates, all of whom were middle and upper class white youth, except for myself. They began drinking in excess and started swapping stories about all of the illicit substances that they had tried in the past. One of my classmates said that he hated going back to U of Chicago where he had done his undergraduate because every time he went back, he did coke. He couldn't help it. It's what his undergraduate friends considered fun. I was incensed. I was offended at how casually they discussed recreational drug use. I berated and scolded them. I told them that addiction ruins lives and that people from my neighborhood would be drug tested the rest of their lives to work minimum wage jobs, while they, my classmates, got cushy law firm offers, cloaked in a presumption of sobriety. Word got back to my professor that I had killed the party, that I had gone on a righteous rant. Tensions between my classmates and myself lingered, and my professor, hoping to ease some of that friction, invited me into her office. After I relayed my concerns to her, she said something to me I will never forget. She said that I needed to realize that my perspective on drugs and drug users was heavily informed by my race, my socioeconomic background, and my upbringing. That poor communities, especially poor communities of color, got an unequivocal message about drug use. That it was bad, that it led to no future, and that it would inevitably land you in prison. She said that middle and upper class, mostly white communities, got a very different message about drugs. That recreational drug use was just that. It was recreation, to be enjoyed in moderation. And should the problem get out of hand, there were resources to assist. It was the first time that I realized that race and income played a tangible, significant role in the way in which we perceived and treated drug use. The distinction that my professor articulated for me that day is especially visible when you compare and contrast the societal response to the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s and the opioid epidemic that we are grappling with today. In the 80s and 90s, many inner city, mostly Black communities were struggling with addiction to crack cocaine. Now, crack was not a drug exclusive to those communities, but that was the prevalent association. And it's the imagery we developed in our collective conscience about what drug users look like. Without saying it aloud, when you hear the phrase crackhead, what image pops in your mind? Bye, Felicia. A phrase that was all the rave on the internet a year or so ago, derived from how dismissive we were of addicts, crack addicts specifically, when they reached out for help or money or food. We considered their request a symptom of their addiction, therefore unworthy of our attention, so bye, Felicia. Or this image, this popular image from the Chappelle Show, or Pookie from New Jack City. Right? The association of crack cocaine with poor Black people was so prevalent, and the vilification and dehumanization of these people so commonplace that it became a tenet of popular culture. We humored it almost without thought, because none of these people are people that you want to invite over your house for dinner. We did not respond to the crack cocaine epidemic with compassion or empathy. We did not humanize addicts or their families or their children. In fact, these are the headlines that we ran in Time magazine and in Rolling Stone and in the New York Times about the children of addicts. Crack kids, their mothers used, and now it's the children who suffer. Childhood's end, what life is like for crack babies. Babies born to crack-addicted mothers are like no others, brain damage yet unknown. They're oblivious to affection. Crack's toll among babies, a joyless view, even of toys. The content of those articles were often even worse than the headlines. One pediatrician from the University of California opined that the part of the brain that makes us human, capable of reflection and discussion, is wiped out in crack babies. I don't even know what that means. But what I do know is that it means that if the part of the brain that makes us human is absent from these humans, then they are something else. They are not like me. They are othered. Right? In a recent article where an author reflected on publications featuring the phrase crack babies from the 80s and 90s, described it this way, quote, "Crack babies calls to mind damaged, hopeless children with birth defects and intellectual disabilities who will inevitably grow into criminals. It connotes inner city Blackness and calls to mind careless, unthinking mothers who knowingly expose their children to the ravages of cocaine. The term made brutes of people of color who were living through wave after wave of what was then the deadliest drug epidemic in history. There was a campaign to dehumanize, a constant affront to the humanity of infants exposed to cocaine." End quote. The legal response was equally detrimental. Beginning in the mid-'80s to '90s, high-level politicians began using criminal rhetoric to frame and describe the crack epidemic. President Richard Nixon said that drugs were public enemy number one, and we had to wage an all-out offensive to restore law and order. Restoration of law and order does not sound like addiction. It sounds like lawlessness, necessitating law enforcement, not medical and health professionals. And that's exactly what we did. It was in those moments that we decided to deal with the crack epidemic as a public safety problem, not as a public health problem. Punitive laws were passed, 3 strikes, mandatory minimum sentencing, artificial distinctions between crack and powder cocaine that stiffened penalties, and incentivized enforcement. Today, there are more people incarcerated for just drug offenses than all people incarcerated for all crimes in 1980. Today, there are more people in prison for just drugs than were incarcerated for all crimes in 1980. Over half of the state prison population and over 2/3 of the federal prison population are there for just drugs. After declaring a war on drugs, drug convictions increased by 1,000%. So how did we get from this place where we vilified and caged addicts, where we encouraged them not to reproduce? This is a photograph of an actual billboard that said, if you are addicted to crack, we will give you free birth control. How did we get from this place to where we are now? In a rehabilitative posture. Beginning in the 1990s, a myriad of factors started converging to create what we now know is the deadliest drug epidemic in history, the opioid crisis. There was a growing heroin problem and loosening regulation on prescribing opiates, coupled with a changing attitude in medicine about the alleviation of pain. We began describing pain as the fifth vital sign. And medical professionals had decided that it was their responsibility to alleviate pain, that pain was bad, and we should eliminate it at all costs. Add to that an aggressive marketing campaign by pharmaceutical companies that mischaracterized the potential for abuse of opiates, all supported by an addict base that was more affluent, younger, and whiter than it had been in the past. It did not fit our conscious imagery as a collective about what addicts look like. They weren't the undesirable, parasitic Felicia and Pookie images that I just had up. In fact, here are the headlines we've ran about the children of the opiate crisis. Children of the epidemic. In the midst of a national opioid crisis, mothers addicted to drugs struggle to get off of them for their baby's sake. For the babies of the opioid crisis, the best care may be mom's recovery. Now, I want you to compare and contrast these two images. The image on my right, I mean, the image on my right, there's flattering lighting. The child is clothed in white with a jovial or at least serene facial expression. And the first word used to describe that child is child, children, right? Now look at the image on my right. Sorry, the other image on my left. This image is on my right. The lighting is darker. This child appears to be in distress, crying, presumably because he's the child of an addict. And the first word used to describe him is crack. All right. I don't think it's a coincidence that I went after Doug. This is probably the only place I get to call him Doug by first name, like I know him personally. Because this is one of the spaces where our rhetoric did not engineer positive outcomes. Where as an audience, it is imperative that we are vigilant in analyzing and thinking critically about what the messaging is here. Because the ironic part is that the thrust of both of these articles is largely the same. Sober parents are better for babies and kids. Who knew? Right? But the messaging and the packaging is markedly different and arouses different sentiments and public responses. One of the articles considered the crisis in a vacuum, void of any societal context, focused solely on the personal decision to use. The other, while still involving discussion of personal choice, included a holistic approach that discussed all of the things infringing upon one's present condition that would lead you to use illicit substances. The result is that one article fostered compassion and empathy and human connection and understanding, while the other vilified, fostered otherness, and disrupted our ability to show compassion and to connect, and enabled us to create policies that were ineffective. The other thing that's different is the political climate at this time. Before, promising to lock up addicts almost guaranteed you votes. And understandably, if you vilify addicts constantly, you make them seem like a threat to your safety. Everyone wants to lock those people up. Try promising to lock up that mother holding her children. People are going to be apprehensive about voting for you. Legal scholars, formerly incarcerated persons, filmmakers, advocates, have all contributed to the public dialogue to change our thinking about crime, criminals, punishment, and prison. Many high-level politicians who were very vocal in advocating for tough policies in the 80s and 90s have retreated from those positions. Many of them have openly admitted that they were wrong and now advocate being smart on crime instead of tough on crime. This year, Newt Gingrich wrote an article where he indicated that the tough policies of the 80s and 90s related to crack, quote, failed miserably, end quote. Former Vice President and Senator Joe Biden, who drafted the 1986 Drug Abuse Act, partly responsible for some of the prison statistics I discussed earlier, testified on record in a hearing in 2008 that he was part of the problem. President Donald Trump has declared the opioid crisis a public health emergency. He has advocated for training and educational campaigns to warn about the dangers of opiates and to help federal prescribers. He has expanded Medicare rehabilitation programs. There was no discussion in any of his remarks about being tough on users, about lawlessness, or about focusing on law enforcement. So we've abandoned many of those policies. We've now adopted programs like DART, encouraging law enforcement officials to respond compassionately to users, or drug courts, intervention in lieu programs, clean needle exchanges, give back your drug days, assistance programs to help addicts find housing and jobs on their way to recovery. So here we have similar drug problems that we've responded to vastly differently. How? How is such a discrepancy even possible? In the book Dreamland, Sam Kionis, yes, I think I said that correctly. It's very difficult, it's spelled in an interesting way. He writes a book where he chronicles the opiate crisis in the States. And in his book, he recounts conversations that he has with drug court judges. And he asks them essentially that exact question. How do we have these vastly different responses to these drug crises? And the judge's answers are simple. The judge says, it's easy to support locking up inner city addicts that have been vilified night after night on the nightly news and in the media and by political pundits. It is much harder to support that when that addict is your child or the child of the local police chief or your pediatrician. And those are the people who have been affected by this crisis. And I think in a more critical, nuanced way, what that means is that it is harder to throw away people you empathize with, that you have compassion for, that you can see yourself in. There's a burgeoning group of researchers who are studying empathy. And one of the things that they have found is that your brain has what they call a mirroring function. Seeing someone do something and being able to envision yourself in that predicament. That could be me dribbling that ball, getting hit by that car, suffering that addiction. And the less you believe yourself to be like that person, the harder it is to exercise your mirroring function, which fosters compassion. I think what Doug was saying about being critical and thinking about the rhetoric that we're hearing and what it means is so important because in part it has contributed to this discrepancy. This is how tragedies like this are born. Because we are not vigilant when we hear things like crack babies, about what that means. We don't think about how it's different from the language of the headlines that are presently being run, or what it means when we humor someone's addiction, when we say they're not like us. Right? So what do we do now? Well, the first thing I think we need to do is to raise awareness that this has happened, that we've treated these two crises markedly differently, and the results of that treatment still reverberate today, most poignantly among those most vulnerable in our society. The second thing we must do is support initiatives aimed at remedying the harm caused by the war on drugs. We messed it up. We need to fix it. It's not enough that politicians are saying, I got it wrong, I'll do better in the future. That doesn't work in a lawsuit. Someone hits your car, they don't get to say, you know what, I messed up your car, I won't hit any more cars in the future. You want them to make you whole. You want them to fix it, and rightfully so. The last thing I think we need to do, it is our responsibility to hold judicial officials, the media, and as a public, ourselves accountable when we hear unchecked storylines that perpetuate stereotypes and false narratives. Part of what we have to acknowledge is that one of the reasons that the opioid crisis has in part spared the Black community is in part because we had poor access to health care to begin with. If we're ever going to be better, if we're ever going to avoid crises like this and make ourselves whole, it is incumbent upon us to be critical, to be diligent, and to be proactive in remedying the mistakes from the past and making better decisions moving forward. You all can eat now. Thank you.